the EMD SD89 Mac. This is a bit of a weird one, and to be fair, I totally understand why it wasn't a success. I'm just surprised by how much of a success it wasn't. The EMD SD89 is, well, a weird number, but there was a good reason for it, as it was meant to be a slightly less powerful version of the SD90 Mac that EMD introduced in 1995. Why would they want to make a less powerful diesel? Well, there are situations where lower horsepower is actually better. For smaller shunting duties, you don't necessarily need a ginormous engine. You would need something smaller. But I think they might have kind of missed the point of making it smaller because the 89 was just as huge as the SD90 Mac. It was just the 89s had less cylinders, 12 compared to the 90's 20. But either way, the single example of the 89 that was created for testing purposes actually performed incredibly well, which may have been a nice thing to see compared to the 90s that were notorious for reliability issues. But despite how decent the 89s appeared to be, they generated absolutely no orders. None. Not a single company took advantage of the SD89 Mac, which is just bizarre because usually even these weird test locomotives will get at least a few orders, 5, maybe 10, like I don't expect a great deal, but no one, not a single soul, was interested in the SD89, which is a shame. But the single example is still being put to good use by EMD as a test bed for other technologies they're working on, so I suppose it wasn't a complete waste. British Rail GT3. Do you want me to pretend to be surprised? 'Cause I won't. The GT3 was an experimental locomotive that was built in 1961 by English Electric. GT3 actually stands for Gas-turbine number 3, and it's actually the successor to two other gas-turbine locomotives, the 18,000 and the 18,100. Now you're probably wondering what a gas-turbine locomotive is, and I'll give you a brief summation. Basically, its power draws from gas turbines. In the GT3's case, it was fueled by kerosene. It's not so dissimilar from a steam turbine locomotive that we talked about before, except instead of steam, it's gas. And the GT3 did look like a futuristic version of a steam locomotive from the outside. It even had a tender, which carried its kerosene fuel. The idea of gas turbine locomotives is a novel one. Similarly to steam turbines, they do have some potential. At very high speeds, they're incredibly efficient. But to be fair, much like steam turbines, the same issue can happen at low speeds, where a lot of what you gain is lost. But the GT3 was built to be as simple as possible. They didn't want to get too zany with it, they wanted to make something that worked. And when they tested it out, they found that it actually was quite good, so long as it was put on lines that were long distance and high speed. It was actually incredibly good for that one purpose. So it's likely that had it been put into proper service, we could have seen more gas turbine locomotives on British rail lines. So why wasn't it? Well, that's because of British Rail. British Rail had already committed to diesel-electric locomotives and were gearing up for their disaster of a modernization plan where they spent just so much money on so many diesels, and only 2 or 3 of them were actually any good. As a result, they had no interest in developing the GT3 further, so its potential is up in the air and debatable. But I'd wager a guess that it may have been worth it in the end had they committed. Additionally, sadly, the GT3 also was not held for preservation, and was scrapped in 1966. Norfolk and Western Railway Class A. Oh, the Class A's. I'm so glad I finally get to talk about these. The Class A's were a group of 43 locomotives constructed by Norfolk and Western between 1936 and 1950, and they were pretty big. 2 664 articulated steam locomotives. They were impressive, powerful, and efficient for what they were. Now, it is a little dubious of me to even put the A-Class on a list of engines that never got a chance to shine, basically, because it did serve for a decent amount of time, 20 years, but they tend to fall in the background compared to other articulated steam locomotives like the Big Boy or the Challenger. Additionally, the A-Class is relevant because it was one of a group of steam locomotives that was put to the test against the modern diesels that started coming out. In 1952, Norfolk and Western wanted to see how their steam locomotives would hold up against the modern diesels. In this case, it was an EMD F7 diesel set. Their testing showed that fuel costs and overall potential in terms of tractive effort was roughly the same, which is actually really impressive because at the time the Class A would have been pushing 15 years old, and the F7 was supposed to be state-of-the-art. Ultimately, though, the diesels still eventually won out because they had lower maintenance and other operational costs. So Norfolk and Western would still wind up replacing the Class A with the modern diesels just like everyone else wound up doing, which is a really sad way to go. Only one of the Class A's survived in the preservation, number 1218, and that locomotive's been around. At first it was used as a stationary boiler at a chemical plant, but eventually it was repurchased for Steamtown, USA in Bellows Falls, Vermont. Then 3 years later, Norfolk and Western did their own cosmetic restoration at their East End shops to be put on display at the Roanoke Transportation Museum in 1971. Then, between 1987 and 1991, Norfolk Southern restored it for operation and used it for their steam program. When that program was canceled, the locomotive was put back on display at the Virginia Museum of Transportation in Roanoke, Virginia, where she currently resides to this day. Not only is she the only surviving Class A, but she's also the only surviving 2664 steam locomotive in the world. The British Rail Advanced Passenger Train, or APT. Wait. Two questions, actually. One, why are you still here? How did you get back in the house? I thought I locked the door. Second of all, we've talked about this before, haven't we? And I bet that's what most of you are wondering. In my very second part of my bad trains top 5, the APT was number 1, as it was largely a failure in many ways. A project that began in the 1970s, it would last until the 80s when, despite its potential, it was basically abandoned and the technology was sold to a company in Italy, which sold it back to the UK. We've been over this before, but the point is, the APT was meant to be a tilt train, and it was very ambitious for its day, and it could have been something great. And that's kind of why I stick it on this list too, because yeah, it turned out badly, but not because the end result would have been. Had British Rail and the powers that be actually stuck to their guns on this, it could have been something pretty sensational and really revolutionized British rail lines overall. But no. As many have pointed out in my original video on the APT, first of all, the tilt function was fixed by the 80s. It did initially make people sick, but they did wind up correcting that problem. See, what really happened here is that early on in the project's development, when the APT was still very much just a prototype, British Prime Minister of that time, Margaret Thatcher, actually alluded to funding cuts for the project. British Rail panicked and just threw the prototypes into service to prove that they could work. But they weren't ready yet. The British media jumped on them and showed off the trains as an example of British Rail's incompetence. And, you know, I'm all for showing the incompetence of British Rail. I do that every day on this channel. But, you know, I try to point to things that are actually true. And when you really get down and look at the story directly under a microscope, you kind of see how it really wasn't British Rail's fault. At least, not completely. I mean, they probably shouldn't have thrown the prototypes into service, but when the government is threatening to shut down your multi-million-dollar project, or I guess it would be British pounds, whatever, ruining years of innovative and difficult work that you know could revolutionize your rail lines, you're gonna try to do whatever to save it. And again, they did wind up saving it, to a degree. The second version was successful, but by that point the media was still slamming the APT as being terrible, even though, in all honesty, if they had actually done their jobs as journalists, you could see that they had fixed the problems. I mean, yeah, the prototypes were bad, but the only reason they were put into service was because British Rail was threatened, not because they actually wanted to do that. But it didn't matter. The APT's wings were cut before it could really fly, and it wound up being replaced with the Intercity 125, which is a similar train set without tilting that's made up of two Class 43s, which are excellent diesels and did well, but it still makes me wonder how a functioning production APT might have changed British Rail early on. Tilt trains may have become the norm in the UK, and they wouldn't have to import them from outside companies. If you're asking my opinion as an American, it comes across as just another case of government mismanagement. And I kind of feel bad even complaining about British Rail in this part, because yeah, we see them a lot, but in this instance, I can't really blame them. Pennsylvania Railroad Class T1. I am so excited that I finally have an excuse to talk about the T1, because, real talk, this is my favorite locomotive ever, and I don't care what anybody says. I love these things. Look at them. Just look at them. They're so cool and sleek and awesome, and they are duplexes. 4444 steam locomotives. Proper duplexes, no articulation, but these things were powerhouses. Produced as the last steam locomotives for the Pennsylvania Railroad, they are an amalgamation of everything the Penzies techs learned about duplexes. Before the T1s, the railroad had produced several different kinds of duplexes, but none of them were really successful at all. But the T1s were meant to learn from those mistakes, and to answer the question, can steam compete with diesel? And the answer was, sadly, apparently, no. Because they didn't, and they never had a chance to. And it's really upsetting to me, not just as somebody that likes them, but also the fact that there's a lot of mystery and controversy surrounding the T1 because it was introduced and removed from service so quickly that its potential is considered relatively unknown. While the prototypes were pretty successful and actually very good, the production models suffered issues with wheel slip, which is actually a pretty common problem for duplexes in general. Thing was, something like that could be seen as a teething problem that could have been easily worked out. It's not unusual for a locomotive when it's first introduced to have some kind of minor defaults or issues that need to be addressed over the first year of its life. On top of that, understand the T1s are one of the strongest steam locomotives ever built in terms of overall speed potential and tractive effort. This is relevant because some people believe that the wheel slip was not actually because there was anything wrong with the locomotives, it was because the engineers hadn't had much time to train on them yet, and therefore weren't used to dealing with such unspeakable power. But this is all hearsay and just theorizing because, again, there's so much about the locomotives that we don't really know, because they were in operation so briefly. The Pennsylvania Railroad just didn't really attempt to fix their problems, they simply removed them and then replaced them with diesels, like everyone else did. However, there is still some hope to get some answers about the T1, and that is because of the T1 Trust. It's a non-profit group that is currently in the process of constructing an all-new, fully operational T1, using the original plans, but adding a few subtle performance improvements that might help those teething problems that we know they had. The locomotive is already being given a number, Pennsylvania Railroad 5550, and the goal is to not only provide mainline excursion service, but also set a world record for speed for a steam locomotive. That record is still held by the London and Northeastern Railway Class A4 4468 Mallard at 126 miles per hour, which was set on the 3rd of July in 1938. The thought process at the T1, with a duplex design, streamlined aesthetics, and power output and potential that is largely unknown, they may have a real chance of actually breaking the record once 5550 is actually finished. I've been keeping tabs on the project ever since it started a few years back, and I gotta say I'm pretty impressed with the fact that they do seem to be making headway. They actually are serious about this, and the locomotive appears to be coming together quite well, and personally, given it's my favorite class of locomotives ever, I'm very excited to see it, regardless of whether they can actually break the record or not. So while the T1 may have never gotten a chance to shine originally, there's still a chance it may shine again one day. We'll have to see. The SWBLW, or the Beep, is actually a single example of a rebuild of a VO1000 constructed by Baldwin, which was one of that company's only successful diesel lines. As you can see, it's a switcher, and I love American switchers. I mean, I am an American, but I really like our switchers. They're so adorable, like all of them, with those little long noses and the single cabs at the end. I've always liked how they look. And just so we're clear, I'm gonna keep calling it a switcher, but for context, my UK audience, you would call this a shunter. Understand that those terms actually mean the same thing, it's just a regional terminology thing. Here we call them switchers, but they're the same as shunters. I've actually had some people from the UK try to correct me on this, and it's not a wrong statement, it's just a regional thing. Now what's the deal with the Beep? Why was there only one? Well, like I said, it was rebuilt from a VO1000, and the reason was that Santa Fe was looking to upgrade their aging fleet of the Baldwin switchers. They'd already had some success rebuilding their CF7s in an effort to modernize them, and the thought was rebuilding should, in theory, be a lot cheaper than purchasing new rolling stock outright. The plan for the Beep, which was Santa Fe number 1460, it actually had several numbers, that's the one it still has, so we're gonna go with that, was to replace some of its old Baldwin components with new EMD prime movers, and the results, in terms of performance, were favorable. The Beep gained significant power output and tractive effort as a result. It was reliable, and the crews loved it, as it had superior riding quality. The problem was cost. As it turned out, the rebuild wound up being more expensive than just purchasing new rolling stock outright. It wasn't economically viable, which is a shame because the locomotive was quite good. As a result, 1460 was the only example of this particular rebuild ever manufactured, and it wound up staying in service for quite a long time. It was originally built in 1943, and the rebuild was finished in 1970. It wasn't retired until 2008, and fortunately it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It was retired, yes, but instead of being scrapped, they opted to donate it to the Western American Railroad Museum in Barstow, California, where it is now sitting on static display. So while she may never have gotten any siblings, she did prove that you could stick EMD components in a Baldwin chassis and make a really good locomotive. So I guess there's that. The British Rail HS4000 Kestrel. You know what? No. Not doing it. Not doing it today. I don't want to. This is a prototype locomotive that was built in 1967 by Brush Traction, and it was meant as a technology demonstrator to pique interest in the new diesel technology that Brush was working on. British Rail put it into service, even though it showed it quite a bit overweight. It was fitted with a Sulzer 16 LVA24 engine rated at 4,000 horsepower, which meant this locomotive could go at least 110 miles per hour. Sleek, fast, and actually quite nice looking. The Kestrel was impressive. While initially restricted mostly to heavy freight service due to it being overweight, it actually proved remarkably good at this, and later it was fitted with new bogies to bring the weight down, and it was used on express passenger trains. So why didn't we see more? Why wasn't there a whole class like this? Well, that largely seems to be unknown. It's unclear why British Rail didn't order it, but if I had to guess, I would say that this locomotive came in just about the tail end of their modernization plan, where they spent a ton of money on a whole bunch of diesels. British Rail actually got in trouble with the government because they were accused of overspending with little to show for it, and to be fair, that was arguably kind of true. So no matter how good the Kestrel appears to have been, British Rail wasn't in a position to invest money in something that, while it could have been good, may not have been. Behind the scenes, they were also starting work on the APT and the HST, and the Kestrel, while amazing in its own right, was a lot closer to the other classes British Rail was still using at the time. As a result, the locomotive was not purchased by British Rail, nor were any orders for anything similar put in. What did happen, that the locomotive was sold to, of all people, the Soviet Union. Yeah, the UK sold it to the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War. I was shocked too. The Kestrel's use behind the Iron Curtain is a little bit of a mystery. What we know is that it would have been re-gauged to 1,520 millimeters, and it's believed it was used a little bit on the Russian rail network, but in the end the engine was actually removed for static testing, and the body was ballasted for use in high load tests of other vehicles. And it's believed that the entire thing was scrapped in 1993, which is a real shame. The EMD RS1325. That name is a mouthful, so I'm going to just call them the RS. Construction as light road switchers by EMD in 1960, the RSs were actually pretty impressive pieces of work for their era. Their cabs were high, and the long hoods were low, making it much easier for the driver to use the locomotive effectively going forward or backwards. They were considered very reliable and really effective for their jobs. So, the real question is, why did they only ever build 2 of them? Well, to begin with, they only ever got an order for 2 of them from the Chicago and Illinois Midland Railway, and those locomotives were numbered 30 and 31. So good are these locomotives that number 30 is actually still in service. It was transferred in 2016 to the Atlantic and Western Railway. Number 31 was acquired by the Monticello Railway Museum, who were working on restoring it. But I still haven't established, why were there only 2 of these things? Well, that seems to be down to bad timing. EMD was proven, yeah, but the 1960s were really rough for American railways. Cars had become incredibly popular, and air travel was becoming affordable. As a result, the railways in America were sandwiched in between 2 other industries, and many that had established themselves over the previous century, like the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central, were hemorrhaging money like crazy. They just didn't have the spare funds to invest in more switchers when they already had plenty of those kicking around. And despite some of those being about 20 years old by this point, they were still able to do the job just fine. So there was no reason for most of the railways to invest in new ones when they were already struggling to make ends meet as it was. It's a shame, but at least the 2 that were manufactured managed to last this long. The Engles 4S. Okay, that's a funny looking locomotive. What the heck is that? And in fact, what the heck is Engles? Well, Engles is a shipbuilding firm based in Pascagoula, Mississippi. At the end of World War II, Engles wanted to try their hand at locomotive manufacturing, and planned a line of several diesel-electric locomotives, although the only one that was ever completed was the 4S. The 4S was actually very advanced. Despite loosely resembling an American car-body diesel of that era, you've probably noticed some obvious differences. The big one being that turret cab arrangement. The cab of the locomotive is set higher so that the crew is able to see both forward and backwards. One of the big problems with car-body diesels of that time, and even now, frankly, is that it's hard for them to run backwards and it's more difficult for the crews to see. But with the turret cab, despite looking maybe a little odd to some people, the crew was able to see pretty well in both directions. It was given a powerful and very reliable prime mover in the form of an inline 8 65 LX8, which was based on a marine diesel engine built by Superior Engines and Compressors. The 4S could produce up to 1,650 horsepower. That may not sound like too much nowadays, but back then, that was pretty good. They were also equipped with connections for multiple unit operation, which was still a bit of a new thing back then. The 4S wound up being tested by various railroads, and even though it did incredibly well, no orders materialized. The theory is that after World War II, railways were a little hesitant to trust, well, someone who was untested when it came to locomotive manufacturing. Engles had never done it before, when compared to the more reliable and known EMD, or even Baldwin and Alco, who were just starting to push out diesel electrics. Engles was unknown, so it was hard to trust them even though the 4S seemed really good. No orders materialized for it, or for any of the other proposed locomotives that Engles wanted to make. As a result, they abandoned their plans for locomotive manufacturing entirely, and the 4S was sold for the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio Railroad, where it was numbered 1900. But the 4S was well liked by the railroad, and among their employees, it gained a reputation for being incredibly tough. It actually derailed once and landed upside down, but it was repaired and returned to service almost immediately. And usually, if they were going to fix something like that, they would take a lot longer, and the 4S just took it, like a champ. However, in 1966, the railroad actually traded it to EMD as partial payment for 22 new SD40s. EMD didn't really have a use for the 4S, so they decided to offer it to the Illinois Railway Museum for $3,000. But unfortunately, the museum actually couldn't raise the funds, and since no one else wanted it, they finally sold it off for scrap in 1967. Which is a shame because I really would have loved to see something like this get preserved. It's a one-of-a-kind locomotive, and I think it would have been really cool to see what other things Engles could cook up if the railways had given the 4S a shot. Sadly, it just wasn't gonna happen. The New York Central Niagara. Oh, the Niagara. I've gotten so many requests for the Niagara, and I get it. Believe me, I get it. The Niagaras were a group of 484 Northern-type steam locomotives that were named after Niagara Falls! Only 27 were ever manufactured, and they were built between 1945 and 1946. They are very distinctive on the basis that they were capable of both high speeds and significant power output. Some rail fans even think the Niagaras may have been the best steam locomotives ever made anywhere, period. But that's a little debatable. But what isn't debatable is that they were outstanding, ambitious, advanced, and phenomenal locomotives. But the real question is, why didn't they last? Well, for the same reason every other steam locomotive didn't last in America. Diesels. The Niagara was one of several locomotives put up for steam versus diesel trial runs, and the results of which were actually absurdly close. So close that the salesmen for the diesels were actually very worried about the Niagaras, but a combination of factors beyond their control would seal the Niagara's fate in the end. There were a series of coal miners' strikes, and the sales teams for dieselization were aggressive, able to shill out diesels to every single railroad around. So despite the fact that the Niagaras had shown that steam could, in fact, compete with diesel power, it just didn't matter. And in this case, the end was remarkably sad, as not a single Niagara survived in the preservation. The Yellowstone type. The Yellowstone type actually refers to a bunch of different models of locomotive, and under the white notation would be 2884 steam locomotives. They're simple articulates, and they saw service on plenty of different railways all across America in particular, such as Northern Pacific, Southern Pacific, Baltimore and Ohio, and the Duluth-Mesabi and Iron Range. They were strong, powerful locomotives, and they had excellent tractive effort, but they were often overshadowed by the much more famous Union Pacific Big Chungus, which is a little unfair because some of the models of Yellowstones actually had better tractive effort than Big Boys. Big Boys had been given an extra leading wheel, as they were 4884s, for better speed performance. The Yellowstones, however, were designed for long, heavy, slow trains, but in that vein, they excelled greatly. Sadly, like many steam locomotives, they showed up very, very late in the lifespan of steam power on the rail lines, and were swiftly replaced by smaller but more efficient diesel locomotives. Very few Yellowstones actually wound up in preservation. most of which came from the Duluth-Mesabian Iron Range. Out of their roster of 18, 3 managed to be preserved and put on display. The Victorian Railway's H-Class. This engine was nicknamed Heavy Harry and was also numbered H220. Constructed in 1941 during World War II, only one H-Class was ever produced. But Heavy Harry lived up to his name, as he was the largest locomotive ever built in Australia, and the largest non-articulated steam locomotive to run on Australian railways. A 484 wheel configuration, Heavy Harry was designed for power, and in that vein he was exceptional, and found to be flexible enough to also haul lighter passenger trains effectively. He was completed during the war because they needed more motive power, but there weren't enough raw materials for a large, powerful steam locomotive to be produced when they could throw out other smaller locomotives instead that could do the jobs well enough. Even after the war, the economic situation and a backlog of maintenance work for Victorian railways meant that Heavy Harry was kind of put by the wayside. He was still in service and was actually considered very successful, despite never really being used for the heavy work he was meant for. By the time they wound up getting into position to produce more of the H-Class, the B-Class diesel-electric locomotives were ready and available, and could perform the necessary work just as well, but with a lighter axle load or the needed for upgraded infrastructure on their rail lines. They still kept Harry around for a few more years yet. On the 20th of May 1956, he was withdrawn for an overhaul, but never put back into service. He was simply kept in storage. But for some good news, the Australian Railway Historical Society lobbied in 1960 for the establishment of a railway museum, and Harry wound up on static display at the Newport Railway Museum. And in April 2008, he was added to the Victorian Heritage Register. Heritage Council Chairman Chris Gallagher once said that the H220 represented the peak of steam motive power technology in Victoria, and believed the locomotive warranted the highest level of heritage protection that the state could provide. And in October 2020, they added a roof over where Harry sits, to protect him from the weather. So all in all, pretty nice retirement for Harry. He never got to do what he was meant to do, but he's still appreciated today, and will continue to be so for many years to come. Also, it's probably worth mentioning that it's believed that Harry's the only remaining example of a 3-cylinder 484 steam locomotive in the world. Just another fun fact about him. The Pennsylvania Railroad Class R1. No, it's not a GG1. I know it looks like that. You are looking at the competitor to the GG1. This interesting prototype creation was created by Baldwin Westinghouse in 1934, specifically to compete with General Electric's GG1, for the spot at being the premier electric locomotive for the Pennsylvania Railway. At a cursory glance, you might mistake it for a GG1, as they look a little similar, but these were 484s under the white notation. A GG1 was 460 plus 064. Both the R1 and GG1 were put together for trials on the Penzies lines, but in the end the GG1 was selected and became one of the best electric locomotives ever produced in America, to be honest. It was chosen over the R1 because they felt it had superior tracking and riding qualities. But the R1 wasn't necessarily bad. In fact, the Penzie thought it was good enough that the prototype still remained in service. It stayed on regular duties for many years, hauling the westbound Broadway Limited and returning eastward with a mail and express train. Due to the long, rigid nature of its wheelbase, it did suffer occasional derailments, but for the most part it was well liked by crews and was able to do its job just fine. The R1 was a pretty good locomotive, it just wasn't considered as good as the outstanding GG1. As a result, it was eventually withdrawn from service, and the single example of it did not survive into preservation. It was scrapped in 1958. The Baldwin Westinghouse number 4000, nicknamed the Blue Goose. This is a very interesting locomotive that is probably not what you think it is. It looks like another diesel, kind of like a shark-nosed diesel that Baldwin was known for. And I like those diesels, and this one definitely also has that interesting angular nose, but this is not a diesel at all. This is an experimental 4,000 horsepower gas-turbine electric locomotive that was designed to demonstrate the technology and potential of gas turbines. Built in 1950, it was demoed for various railways all across America. So what happened to it? Well, the technology was impressive, and by all accounts the Blue Goose was actually legitimately good even as a prototype. It could do its job and do it very well. The problem was that in the 50s, diesel electrics were a dominant force. They'd been proven. and proven to be effective. They were a safe bet, rather than something that was a bit more alien to the railways. In the 50s, the railways were starting to struggle financially, and the notion of taking a chance on something that was completely untested, and that could have so many issues they just didn't know about, no matter how good the prototype seemed, just wasn't a reasonable bet for them to make. As a result, the Blue Goose found no buyers at all, which is a real shame because it definitely seems like Westinghouse and Baldwin may have been onto something with the Blue Goose. But it was not to be, and it was scrapped in 1953. The British Rail D0260. No, you can't be here. I thought I was rid of you. You said you were leaving, and you lied to me. You lied. You're a liar. You lied. You can't. What are you doing? Somebody help! Make it go away! Make it go away! Now, to be fair, the British Rail... Sorry, just threw up in my mouth a little bit. The British Rail D0260 was not technically a British Rail creation in any sense of the word. It was a private venture developed by Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon Company, as well as AEI Limited. It was nicknamed the Lion, and it was built in 1962, right in the middle of a terrible, terrible time in British rail history, and it had a very interesting livery setup. It was, well, tan. Well, white, actually, which showed off dirt, but it definitely made it stick out compared to the other locomotives on the line. And in many ways, the Lion was an ambitious and interesting development in terms of diesel-electric designs. A lot of their components were mounted in their roofs, giving more space in the body itself. And the engines were considered very reliable, and capable of 2,750 horsepower, and with a speed of 100 miles per hour. It tested extremely well, and much of its body design was also kind of taking some steps from a hood unit. A lot of the inner workings could be accessed very easily through doors located on the side of the locomotive. Truth be told, a lot of the technology that went into the Lion would go on to become kind of standard for a lot of diesel electrics in the future. It just never got a chance to do anything on its own. Though testing went well, it was withdrawn from service in February of 1964. The reason for this seems to be down to its competitor, the British Rail Class 47. The 47 was chosen over the Lion for a handful of reasons, and it may simply be that the 47 was more familiar as a diesel electric. A lot of its design was very standard and safe, whereas the Lion was a little more experimental in its ethos. This was the 60s, and the British Rail was already quite in the middle of the mess that was dealing with all the bad diesels they'd purchased. They couldn't risk taking a chance at that time, so the Lion was out, and they took the 47s. And to their credit, the 47s turned out to actually be genuinely good. Some are still in service now. As for the Lion, well, we know it was scrapped, but the actual specifics in terms of when it was scrapped are somewhat of a mystery. We know it was taken to the AEI works, where they took out their electrical components and stripped it down in other ways, and then the rest of it was sent off to the Attercliffe yard for scrap. The date in which this was actually done is unknown, but it's believed that it did not survive past 1965. Which is a bit of a shame, because while I do understand this horrible organization's point regarding its experimental status and not being willing to take a chance on it, it seems like Birmingham and AEI may have been onto something with the Lion, and it might have done extremely well if it was ever put into mass production, but sadly, it was not to be.